From Jennifer Hudson, the superstar breaking down on the stand. She was a first witness in the trial of her former brother-in-law charged in the...
Nicole said it best. The trauma of my mother's death is not the story of her life. Woo!
Having endured the pain of losing 3 loved ones in just one night for 16 years, Jennifer Hudson finally musters up the courage to confront her family's brutal murderer. William Balfour, known as Jennifer's brother-in-law, has become the most disgusting obsession, not only for the Hudson family, but also for everyone who has heard about this painful tragedy. Jennifer Hudson is now able to calmly recount the whole truth about that fateful day. Let's listen to her. In the early months of 2008, Jennifer Hudson appeared to be on top of the world. Her career was thriving, following her critically acclaimed performance in the 2006 musical drama Dreamgirls, where her portrayal of Effie White brought her widespread recognition and praise. Hudson had achieved what many aspiring actors and singers only dream of. Her role in the film earned her an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, and her powerful voice and on-screen presence left a lasting impact on audiences and critics alike. From American Idol contestant to Oscar-winning actress, Hudson's rise to fame seemed unstoppable. At this time, Hudson was also deeply rooted in her family, a foundation that had always been a significant part of her life. Her close-knit family in Chicago included her sister Julia, her mother Darnell Donnerson, and her 7-year-old nephew Julian King. Hudson had often spoken about how much her family meant to her, crediting them for helping her stay grounded despite her success in the entertainment industry. The bond she shared with them was palpable, and her love for her family was evident in the joy she expressed whenever she spoke about them. However, Hudson's life was forever changed in October 2008 when her family was struck by an unimaginable tragedy. Her former brother-in-law, William Balfour, shattered their lives with an act of violence that left an indelible scar on the Hudson family. Balfour, who was estranged from Hudson's sister Julia, unleashed his anger in a brutal attack on the family. He entered their Chicago home and took the lives of Hudson's mother, Darnell, her brother, Jason, and her beloved nephew, Julian. The tragedy was a horrific blow, thrusting Hudson and her sister into an abyss of grief, loss, and devastation. The emotional aftermath of the murders was understandably overwhelming for Hudson and her sister. For Jennifer, a woman who had always been in the public eye, the pain was compounded by the intense media scrutiny that followed the tragedy. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, Hudson retreated from the spotlight. Both she and Julia initially chose silence as a way to cope, grappling with the shock and the unfathomable reality of losing their loved ones in such a brutal manner. The story began at her family's Chicago home, where Hudson's 57-year-old mother, Darnell Donnerson, was found shot to death in her own living room. The horror of the scene was heightened by the fact that she was not alone. Hudson's older brother, Jason Hudson, was also discovered dead in the home, having suffered fatal gunshot wounds. This shocking crime scene sent waves of fear through Hudson's family, as they realized that her sister Julia's 7-year-old son, Julian King, was missing. When police arrived at the house, it became apparent that Jason's SUV was also missing, raising grave concerns that the young boy may have been taken against his will. Authorities quickly issued an AMBER alert for Julian, hoping to locate him in time. The sense of urgency and fear grew stronger as family, friends, and fans across the nation held on to hope for his safe return. Despite the widespread efforts to locate Julian, the search came to a tragic end 2 days later, on October 26th. Police discovered the missing SUV abandoned on Chicago's west side, and inside, they found Julian's lifeless body. The young boy had been shot twice in the head, an unimaginable end for an innocent child who had his whole life ahead of him. The tragedy struck a chilling chord, as the murder of a young child layered an additional depth of horror onto the already devastating loss Hudson and her family had experienced. The grief of losing not just one, but 3 family members to such violent ends was shattering. For Hudson, the pain of these murders was compounded by the horrific circumstances: the loss of a mother who had raised her, a brother with whom she shared an inseparable bond, and a young nephew who had brought immense joy to her life. The aftermath left Hudson in a state of shock and sorrow, forcing her to withdraw from public life to grieve privately with her remaining family. Reportedly, amidst this unimaginable loss, a glimmer of hope persisted. Julian, Hudson's 7-year-old nephew, was missing but unaccounted for. There was a chance he might still be alive. The days following the murders were a period of intense fear and uncertainty for the Hudson family and the entire community. Authorities issued an Amber Alert for Julian, quickly mobilizing efforts to locate him. Police officers, volunteers, and local residents were all on high alert, and the hope that he might be found safe kept family and supporters clinging to any possible sign or tip. Hudson herself made public pleas, asking for information that could lead to his safe return. The city of Chicago felt the weight of the tragedy, united in the hope of finding Julian alive and well. 2 agonizing days later, on October 26th, police located the SUV that had been missing from the Hudson home since the murders. It was parked on Chicago's West Side, an area that had seen many violent incidents in the past. Upon finding the vehicle, officers approached with caution, hoping for the best but fearing the worst. Tragically, their fears were confirmed. Inside the SUV, they found Julian's lifeless body. The young boy had been fatally shot, his small frame slumped in the vehicle, having endured a violent end that no child should face. He had been shot twice in the head, a detail that underscored the brutality of the crime and left a lasting impression on those who discovered him. The news shattered any remaining hope the family had been holding on to. What had once been a devastating loss now took on an even deeper layer of tragedy, with the murder of a young child adding to the already overwhelming grief. Julian's death marked a point of no return for Hudson and her sister Julia. The pain and sorrow of losing not only a mother and a brother but also an innocent child were almost unbearable. For Hudson, the death of Julian, her nephew, who had brought so much joy to her life, represented the ultimate cruelty in an already heartbreaking situation. Many people are curious about the relationship between William Balfour and Jennifer's family, so here is the answer. In October 2008, as the marriage between William Balfour and Julia Hudson crumbled, tensions boiled over into an unthinkable tragedy that would devastate the Hudson family. Balfour, a 27-year-old man with a turbulent history and a penchant for violent outbursts, had married Julia Hudson, the sister of singer and actress Jennifer Hudson, in what began as a hopeful relationship. They shared a son, Julian King, and for a time there was hope that they could build a stable family together. However, the marriage was fraught with conflict, and any semblance of happiness was overshadowed by Balfour's volatile personality and frequent outbursts, often rooted in jealousy and insecurity. Over the years, Julia's family became increasingly concerned about her relationship with Balfour. Jennifer, her sister, and their brother Jason had both seen Balfour's controlling and aggressive behavior, and they feared for Julia and Julian's well-being. Jason, in particular, encouraged Julia to leave Balfour, urging her to protect herself and her son from his explosive temper. Their mother, Darnell Donnerson, also voiced her concerns, cautioning Julia about the risks of staying in a relationship with someone as unpredictable as Balfour. For Julia, her family's warnings weighed heavily on her mind, especially as the strain in her marriage continued to grow. By the fall of 2008, Julia had made up her mind. She told Balfour that their relationship was over, a decision that would later prove to be a catalyst for unimaginable violence. Balfour did not take the news well. Instead of accepting the end of their marriage, he became consumed with anger, seeing Julia's decision as a betrayal one encouraged and supported by her family. Balfour reportedly fixated on the idea that Julia's family was responsible for the dissolution of their marriage, believing that they had convinced her to leave him and, in his mind, to take away his son. This twisted perspective intensified his anger, transforming it into a dangerous obsession with retribution. Some people said that William Balfour's tragic and violent endgame with the Hudson family can be traced back to an upbringing shaped by chaos, neglect, and violence, a life trajectory that seemingly set him on a dark path from a young age. Balfour's early life was marked by instability and abandonment, leaving him with deep emotional scars and unresolved anger that would later fuel his actions. Balfour's father, whom he scarcely remembered, had gone to prison for murder when he was very young. This loss of a father figure set the stage for a childhood spent under the shadow of trauma and violence, compounded by an abusive mother who struggled with her own issues. In this environment, Balfour was exposed to constant conflict, instability, and exposure to drug abuse, a harrowing combination that would later shape his sense of self and his view of the world. By the time he was 14, Balfour was essentially adrift, having been abandoned by his mother. He found himself in a youth shelter, already struggling with a heroin addiction and navigating the streets of Chicago alone. Life became a cycle of temporary stays in shelters, stints living on the street, and occasional encounters with his mother, who would reappear sporadically in his life. While she attempted at times to reconnect with him, her presence was unreliable and fleeting, never providing the consistency or security a child needed. This lack of parental support left Balfour with a profound sense of loss and abandonment, and, as therapists later observed, contributed to deep-seated anger and resentment. Balfour's time in shelters and on the streets only reinforced his detachment and distrust of others, adding layers to his feelings of isolation and rejection. As he grew older, Balfour's struggle with abandonment began to manifest in troubling ways. He suffered from depression and insomnia, conditions that left him emotionally volatile and prone to erratic behavior. Without a support system or role models to guide him, he found it difficult to form healthy relationships or cope with his emotions constructively. Therapy and evaluations later revealed that Balfour's life had been one marked by unaddressed trauma, particularly in his relationships with women. He had been exposed to toxic relationships from a young age, witnessing family dynamics where conflict, mistrust, and violence prevailed. As a result, Balfour's interactions with women were often characterized by lashing out and a need to control, a manifestation of the anger and mistrust that had taken root early on. Balfour's struggles were further compounded by a family history rife with addiction and criminal activity. He grew up surrounded by relatives who themselves grappled with substance abuse, and several family members had criminal records, including convictions for murder or manslaughter. This chaotic family environment left Balfour without a stable foundation or positive examples of how to resolve conflict or manage relationships. With a family where violence was not uncommon and where drug addiction was pervasive, Balfour was never exposed to the healthy coping mechanisms or life skills that might have helped him navigate his own challenges. Instead, he internalized the dysfunction around him, developing a worldview in which violence, anger, and retribution were familiar patterns. As for Jennifer, this horrific event not only shattered Hudson's close-knit family, but also turned her life upside down in a way that would impact her forever. The murders of her loved ones left Hudson and her sister Julia grappling with a level of trauma few can comprehend. As Julia sank into a deep depression, struggling to cope with the loss of her child, husband, and family members, Hudson found herself navigating her own grief while supporting her sister through unimaginable sorrow. Initially, Hudson refrained from speaking publicly about the murders. Her instinct was to keep her grief private, shielding herself and her sister from the scrutiny and sensationalism that followed the tragedy. But as the case moved to trial, Hudson found herself standing on the witness stand, determined to confront the man accused of tearing her family apart, her former brother-in-law, William Balfour. Her testimony became a key piece of the trial, offering insight not only into Balfour's character, but also into the extent of the pain and devastation his actions had caused. Hudson's relationship with Balfour dates back years. They had known each other since childhood, attending the same sixth-grade class, where Hudson had reportedly never liked him. In her testimony, she described him as an unpleasant presence, someone she tried to avoid even then. From her perspective, Balfour had always been a poor match for her sister Julia. She testified that the entire Hudson family had voiced concerns about the relationship, with each of them urging Julia not to marry him. "None of us wanted her to marry him," she told the court. Her words conveyed a mix of sadness and frustration, as if reflecting on all the red flags she and her family had seen, and the tragic consequences of Julia's choice to marry him despite their warnings. Hudson's apprehension toward Balfour had grown over the years as his behavior became increasingly unpredictable and controlling. During her testimony, Hudson recounted how she had intentionally kept her distance from him, stating, "I tried to keep my distance with William any chance I got. Where he was, I tried not to be." Her instinctive discomfort around him was profound. She felt an aversion that she could never quite shake, a sense that something was deeply wrong with the man who had become part of her family. Now, let's talk about the mysteries of Julia Hudson and William Balfour's relationship. Reportedly, they were strained and difficult from the start, a tumultuous union that would soon turn dark and frightening. Although Julia initially tried to make things work for the sake of her family, the relationship became increasingly volatile and left her feeling controlled, intimidated, and isolated. Over time, it became clear that Balfour's temper and erratic behavior posed a genuine threat, and Julia eventually began to distance herself. With her family's support, particularly from her mother Darnell and her brother Jason, she tried to make a break from Balfour, though the road to doing so proved treacherous. One of the most alarming aspects of their relationship was Balfour's capacity for intimidation. He reportedly made chilling comments, including threats that left Julia deeply uneasy. There were instances when he appeared at her workplace and made concerning statements, words that seemed to hint at potential harm to her and those close to her if she ever left him. These threats, along with his behavior at her job, made Julia feel trapped, as though she couldn't safely separate from him. The comments Balfour made were frighteningly specific and pointed, and Julia later revealed that he had once said he would harm those around her, a remark that her family took seriously as a warning sign. His words hung over her, casting a shadow on any thoughts of escape and making the reality of leaving him even more challenging. Beyond his behavior toward Julia, there were also troubling signs that Balfour might not have been following the conditions of his parole. Having previously served time, he was supposed to abide by strict guidelines, including prohibitions on substance use and restricted access to certain items. However, rumors circulated that he may have been using substances again and gaining access to prohibited objects, though this wasn't always easy to prove. This potential disregard for the rules further added to Julia's unease, as it suggested a tendency to flout authority and disregard consequences. Balfour's apparent indifference to the boundaries set by his parole only underscored his lack of control and disregard for rules that were supposed to keep him in check. What complicated Julia's feelings further was Balfour's involvement in other relationships outside their marriage, something that, in retrospect, added an additional layer of deceit and betrayal. Despite his controlling behavior and efforts to keep Julia close, Balfour reportedly saw other women and was even expecting a child with one of them. This revelation left Julia reeling as she realized he had not only disregarded her safety and well-being, but was also leading a double life. For Julia, Balfour's infidelity highlighted the contradiction in his behavior. He wanted to control her, yet he himself was unfaithful, callous, and disloyal. Let's return to the horrific case. The trial of William Balfour brought to light a series of unsettling details that pointed to a premeditated plan behind the tragedy that struck the Hudson family in October 2008. Witnesses recounted eerie encounters with Balfour that painted a picture of a man consumed by anger and vengeance, seemingly unable to let go of his estranged wife, Julia Hudson, and her family. Testimonies revealed that Balfour had not only harbored a grudge against Julia and those around her, but had also allegedly taken steps to keep them within his reach, even after Julia had made it clear she wanted more to do with him. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence presented during the trial came from Reginald Jones, a family friend and neighbor of the Hudsons. Jones testified that he had encountered Balfour lurking outside the Hudson family home during the summer of 2008, just months before the murders took place. According to Jones, he was walking home late at night when he noticed Balfour sitting alone in the dark at the bottom of the stairs leading to the family's front door. Balfour was positioned right beneath Julia's bedroom window, his figure cloaked in shadow. At the time, Jones thought little of the encounter, though it struck him as odd. He had exchanged a few words with Balfour, but the latter's demeanor was unsettling, silent, distant, and with an air of hostility that seemed to go beyond the bounds of normal behavior. In retrospect, Jones realized that this eerie late-night presence was likely more than just a momentary lapse in judgment on Balfour's part. It may have been the beginnings of a plan. As Jones recounted this testimony, a picture began to form of Balfour's obsession and escalating fixation on his estranged wife. Julia had been working to separate herself from him, yet he continued to find ways to maintain a connection, even if it was one rooted in control and intimidation. Witnesses like Jones pointed to a pattern of surveillance and intimidation in Balfour's actions, suggesting that he had been keeping tabs on Julia's movements and, by extension, the rest of her family. This consistent monitoring indicated a level of premeditation that added a chilling layer to an already horrific crime. Another witness, Maria Wilkes, provided further insight into Balfour's obsessive and menacing behavior. Wilkes, who was only 13 at the time, recounted a series of interactions with Balfour that underscored his willingness to threaten those around Julia if he felt they might interfere. Wilkes testified that she had seen Balfour following Julia to a park one afternoon, where he approached her in a menacing manner. Wilkes overheard Balfour pressing Julia for information about how to reach her, seemingly ignoring her pleas for him to leave her alone. The fact that Balfour would go as far as following her to a public place, confronting her in broad daylight, was indicative of his brazen disregard for boundaries and respect for Julia's wishes to move on. In addition to the park confrontation, Wilkes recalled a personal run-in with Balfour that solidified her sense of danger around him. She testified that she had seen him approach her on the street, unprovoked and aggressive. Wilkes, sensing that he might mean her harm, warned him that she would go to the police if he didn't stop harassing her. Balfour's response to her was a chilling threat. He told her that he would kill her and her family if she ever went to the authorities. For a young girl, this encounter must have been terrifying, and it revealed the lengths to which Balfour was willing to go to intimidate those around Julia, especially anyone who might be inclined to protect her. Then Balfour was taken into custody the same day Jennifer Hudson's mother, Darnell Donnerson, and brother, Jason Hudson, were discovered murdered in their Chicago home, but he wasn't formally charged right away. The police initially apprehended him at his girlfriend's apartment, suspecting him in connection with the murders, yet due to insufficient evidence, they couldn't make an immediate arrest for the killings. The following week saw a painstaking investigation marked by tense waiting periods and a complicated web of testimonies that eventually exposed Balfour's involvement. When police arrived at the apartment, Balfour's reaction was evasive and uncooperative. He refused a polygraph test, an early indication that he may have been concealing the truth. His girlfriend, however, provided the authorities with statements that contradicted Balfour's alibi, She claimed that he had admitted involvement in the murders of Darnell and Jason, though she suggested he hadn't harmed young Julian. This testimony was significant, as it implied Balfour had confided his role in the tragedy to her, yet she stopped short of implicating him in Julian's murder at that point. With her statements hinting at his involvement, investigators were able to continue their inquiries, although the lack of conclusive evidence to directly tie him to all three murders posed a challenge. Balfour's refusal to cooperate, coupled with inconsistencies in his alibi, kept suspicions high, though the police needed more concrete proof to hold him. Under Illinois law, authorities are permitted to detain a suspect without filing charges for up to 48 hours, a time limit they pushed to the maximum in Balfour's case. This period was crucial for investigators as they scrambled to piece together evidence and corroborate testimonies, yet by the end of those 2 days, they still lacked the necessary proof to formally accuse him. With no option but to release Balfour, law enforcement was left frustrated, as was the Hudson family. Jennifer Hudson, meanwhile, had to face the unimaginable task of identifying her family members' bodies, an ordeal that further underscored the heartbreak and trauma the Hudsons were enduring. In a tragic twist, just 2 days after Balfour's release, the body of Jennifer's 7-year-old nephew, Julian, was found in Jason's stolen SUV. Police had issued an Amber Alert immediately after discovering the bodies of Darnell and Jason, hoping that Julian might still be alive somewhere, but their fears were confirmed when the young boy was found shot in the head. The discovery of Julian's body shocked and saddened the nation, further intensifying public outcry and demand for justice. This grim revelation added another layer of horror to the case, as it was now clear that the killer had not spared even the youngest member of the Hudson family. Authorities now had more pressure than ever to build a solid case against Balfour, though they still lacked the direct evidence needed to secure his arrest. Although Balfour was released, his freedom was temporary. Shortly after his release, it was determined that he had violated the terms of his parole. This technical infraction provided authorities with the opportunity to detain him again in November 2008, nearly a month after the murders. While Balfour was held on parole violations, investigators worked to gather additional evidence that would definitively link him to the crimes. During this time, law enforcement employed various investigative techniques, including gathering forensic evidence from the crime scenes and collecting witness statements, as they worked to piece together a case that could stand up in court. By December 1, 2008, authorities finally gathered enough evidence to arrest Balfour formally and charge him with murder. This development brought a sense of relief to the Hudson family and the public, who had been following the case closely, desperate for justice. The breakthrough came not only from forensic evidence, but also from further cooperation from Balfour's girlfriend. In a later statement, she revealed that Balfour had confessed to the murders shortly after they occurred. This confession was pivotal in the case, providing investigators with a clearer view of Balfour's actions and intentions on the day of the murders. Her willingness to come forward underscored the depth of his connection to the crime, removing any lingering doubt that he had been responsible for the brutal loss the Hudson family had suffered. Throughout the investigation and subsequent trial, William Balfour maintained his innocence, asserting that he was not capable of harming his own family. Balfour insisted that he had loved Julia Hudson and her son, Julian, and he expressed disbelief that anyone could think he would harm a child he cared for deeply. His defense team built their strategy around these denials, portraying him as a scapegoat in a high-profile case that they argued had been mishandled by law enforcement and exploited by the media due to Jennifer Hudson's fame. The defense argued that the case against Balfour was mostly circumstantial, lacking direct evidence that tied him conclusively to the murders. They highlighted that much of the prosecution's case hinged on witness testimonies and inferred motives rather than hard evidence. According to the defense, the prosecution's rush to bring Balfour to trial was largely a reaction to media pressure and the public's desire for justice in a case so closely associated with a celebrity. They claimed that Balfour's connection to Jennifer Hudson was the real reason he had been targeted so swiftly as the prime suspect, not because of any substantial proof against him. One major point the defense emphasized was the absence of DNA evidence directly linking Balfour to the crime scene. While Balfour was known to have owned a gun of the same caliber as the weapon used in the murders, the police were never able to recover the murder weapon itself. The bullets used in the shootings were linked to a type of gun Balfour had access to, but without the actual weapon in their possession, the prosecution's case lacked a concrete link to him. This absence of physical evidence, particularly DNA, allowed the defense to raise reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. They argued that while it was easy to connect Balfour to Julia's family on an emotional level, proving he had been at the crime scene without physical evidence was speculative at best. Adding complexity to the defense's argument was the history of Julia's brother, Jason Hudson, who had a record of selling drugs. The defense argued that Jason's involvement in drug-related activities posed a much more plausible explanation for the tragedy. They suggested that the murders were a tragic result of Jason's connections to dangerous individuals in Chicago's drug trade, individuals who might have targeted the Hudson family as an act of retribution. By bringing Jason's criminal background into the discussion, the defense aimed to shift the focus away from Balfour and onto the possibility that Jason had been the true target, and that the other family members had simply been unfortunate collateral damage in an unrelated conflict. The question of the murder weapon itself added a layer of doubt that the defense exploited throughout the trial. Investigators had discovered that Jason Hudson had once reported a gun stolen from his home, and some of the bullets recovered at the scene were initially thought to be from that same firearm. However, ballistics tests eventually revealed that the bullets used in the murders matched a gun stolen from Michigan, a gun that Balfour had no known connection to. This inconsistency raised questions as to how the gun had entered the equation and if it could definitively be tied back to Balfour. By the end of William Balfour's trial, the prosecution had painted a picture so compelling that neither the judge nor the jury doubted his guilt. Balfour, who chose not to testify in his own defense, maintained his silence as the prosecution laid out the case against him, with the jury hanging on every detail of the horror he was accused of unleashing on the Hudson family. The emotional toll on the Hudson family and the severity of the crime weighed heavily on the courtroom, and this gravity was not lost on the judge presiding over the trial. When the guilty verdict was finally handed down, the sentencing judge delivered his judgment with words that cut as deeply as any punishment could. Addressing Balfour directly, the judge spoke to the perceived emptiness of Balfour's character, a man who claimed he loved his young stepson, but whom the judge saw as utterly devoid of empathy or remorse. The judge remarked with solemnity and conviction, stating, "Your heart is an Arctic night, and your soul is as barren as dark space." These words, as chilling as they were powerful, echoed the brutal nature of the crimes and the judge's view of the man convicted of committing them. For the murder of Jennifer Hudson's mother, Darnell Donnerson, her brother, Jason Hudson, and her nephew, Julian King, Balfour received 3 consecutive life sentences, one for each life he had taken. But the punishment didn't end there. The judge added an additional 120 years to Balfour's sentence, reflecting the court's determination to ensure he would never walk free again. This extra time was attributed to multiple charges, including home invasion, possession of a stolen vehicle, and the especially painful charge of aggravated kidnapping, a nod to the harrowing details of Julian's abduction and the eventual discovery of his body. Balfour's lack of testimony during the trial may have been strategic from a defense standpoint, as his history and behavior would have likely faced brutal scrutiny under cross-examination. But his silence left many questions unanswered, questions that haunted the Hudson family and the public. Even after the guilty verdict was delivered, Balfour continued to insist on his innocence, making statements to the media that he had nothing to do with the case and expressing confusion over who could have committed such crimes. This was in stark contrast to the overwhelming evidence and testimonies that had been presented over the course of the trial, convincing both the judge and jury of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Since his sentencing, Balfour has maintained his claims of innocence. He has repeatedly stated in various interviews that he was wrongfully accused and convicted. He has asserted, "I didn't have anything to do with the case and don't know who had anything to do with the case." However, his words have done little to sway public opinion or the judicial system. Appeals were filed, but the courts have consistently upheld the original conviction, reinforcing their confidence in the evidence and the trial's outcome. The additional 120 years attached to his 3 life sentences were not only symbolic, but also practical, ensuring that there would be no loophole, no possibility of parole, and no avenue for him to ever return to society. The court's decision reflected a zero-tolerance approach to crimes of such violence and betrayal, particularly those that claimed the lives of a mother, a brother, and a young child in their own home. What do you think about William Balfour's crimes against the Hudson family? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.